quick word of warning. We're going to discuss some heavy themes as part of Karen's story, such as mental health, eating disorders, her hospitalisation for anorexia, childhood trauma, and themes of emotional neglect.
Hello, and welcome to Empathy for the Devil. I'm Sam Parker.
I'm Matt Thomas.
I'm Chula Gunawardena.
In every episode, we're going to be diving into the lives of individuals in the spotlight who left us too soon, but may still face harsh judgments for how they lived, what they became, or how they died.
Join us as we peel back the layers of their stories with empathy and understanding, exploring their journeys from mortals to myths from a modern mental health perspective, aiming to understand the person behind the legend.
We want to bring empathy to the misunderstood, misjudged, or even demonised. Empathy for the devil. So, Karen Carpenter, as you may well be aware, and I'm sure you are, iconic tracks, just to remind everybody, Close to You, Top of the World, and of course we've only just begun. The Carpenters consisted of Karen and her brother Richard. They shot to fame at a very young age and signed to A&M Records when Karen was just 19.
Wow.
Young.
I think Richard's a couple of years older, maybe 2 or 3 years older. So following their rise to fame, it happened really, really quickly, actually. It was just after their second single. And what also, I guess, happened very, very quickly was the kind of onset of troubles, really, that accompanied that rise to stardom.
As it often does.
As it often does, yeah. In fact, it makes it worse.
Yeah.
So behind the smiling pictures and the legendary siblings, there was a darker story. And that's what I would really, really like to unpack today with you guys.
Yeah.
So relationships, deceit, a desperately misunderstood mental illness, anorexia, and one that eventually resulted in Karen's death in 1983.
Yeah.
Okay.
So without further ado, let's light a candle for Karen. So here we go. There we are. So we can hold her in compassion and just recognise what a fucking kick-ass motherfucking musician she was.
Yeah.
Actually, I might say. Because I don't just want to focus on Karen, the problem, Karen, the anorexic, Karen, the this, Karen, the that. She was an incredible fucking musician. And in doing my research, she was an incredible drummer, and considered herself as a drummer that could sing. So let's just state that for the record.
Yeah, which is a talent in itself. So Sam, why did you want to speak about Karen Carpenter? You know, why is her story important?
Her story, I think, is important because she was probably the first high-profile person who suffered from anorexia.
Right.
And during the 70s, there was very little understanding about what that was about. And also, I guess, you know, what we're trying to do here with this podcast in a way is kind of look at what happened, what was available, what could have been done, but also acknowledge the fact that we know so much more now about trauma. We know so much more now about addiction than we ever did before. You know, so to a degree, Karen's story kind of I don't know, is the embodiment of that idea that had she presented with that now, it would probably be a very different story. Yeah. I guess there's also a personal link for me. My best friend is in recovery from anorexia. And so I guess I've had the experience of seeing that. And it is heartbreaking, actually. It is a very difficult thing to watch and to get your head around the fact that, I don't know, maybe unlike other addictions in terms where you might see the benefit of being drunk or the benefit of being high. You know, in other words, I used to take drugs. I get how that can be fun. And I also get the fact that for some people who are addicts, it stops being fucking fun at some point. But the idea of starving yourself, I don't get, because that's pleasure for me is eating, and I derive so much pleasure from that. So the idea of not doing that, it just seems really alien. And the deterioration physically, not just in terms of weight, but, you know, your teeth drop out, your fucking toenails come off, and that's on the exterior, let alone what's going on with your heart and your organs and so on and so forth. And actually it does have the highest mortality rate of these psychiatric conditions.
Yeah. And there's something deeply saddening about someone who isn't able to nourish themselves.
And it's shocking.
Yeah,
it's visceral and it's distressing.
Very.
So that's kind of my connection to it.
I think out of the addictive disorders that I've worked with, food issues definitely is one of the hardest.
Do you think?
Without a doubt, yeah.
I've also found it's quite difficult to get professionals to engage with people suffering with anorexia. I've worked with a few clients that I've needed to refer onwards, and it's been really difficult. And
Sorry.
Bless you, Tula. And what I found is that the worse their condition, the harder it is to get help.
The more underweight they are.
Yeah.
Or their BMI.
The more underweight they are, the harder it is to get help. It's a real specialist area, and it's a real struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is as well, you know, as I kind of touched on earlier, you know, and I did George Michael, as you know, and there's a real sort of correlation, I think, between their incredible, obviously their vocal range and power of their voice, but it's, you know, there's that quality of the cry in the soul. You know, you can hear the wounding in both of them, actually. And finally, you know, I grew up with the Carpenters. I mean, what house didn't have a best of the Carpenters in the late 70s, early 80s? It kind of puts me in mind of the sort of wholesome family. You know, you'd have that on the stereo, wouldn't you? And then you might have the Carpenters Christmas album, and you know, it was something that pretty much everybody liked, and very few people would have disliked.
And it was really 70s, wasn't it? Right there with the Partridge Family and the Brady Bunch and all of that good old American values.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Karen was born in New Haven, Connecticut on March the 2nd in 1950. She had a difficult relationship with her mother, Agnes. Karen felt desperately unloved by Agnes. Now, Agnes is an interesting one, actually. Obviously, we've seen the TV movies and there's been lots of books written about the Carpenters, and Agnes comes up again and again and again as a major theme. So I really wanted to kind of drill down and find out a little bit more about Agnes, rather than simply saying she was cold and difficult and contributed to Karen's misery. So Karen grew up in a household which was predominantly dominated by Richard's prodigal talent. I think he was 3 when he started, and so this kind of bright, extraordinary talent kind of became quite clear quite early on in his life. So Karen was born a couple of years after that. I mean, you know, having a child that's got extraordinary talent is, for parents, is a bit of a tricky one, isn't it? Because it is going to pull you into something that probably you didn't expect, and that you feel like you have a duty to cater to. I think, quite sadly, that probably left her not getting as much attention as she probably would do normally. To me, it felt a bit like there was something about Richard's talent that set them apart as a family. Right. That made them special, different, good. Yeah. And they came from a very, like I say, a very ordinary town, very ordinary background. And there was something extraordinary about Richard, which led them to actually move to California in order, you know, to surround him with what he needed in order to express this incredible talent.
And it sounds like his talent overshadowed everyone in the family, including Karen.
Yeah, they moved to a suburb in LA in 1963. As I was reading, I found a reflection on somebody that used to live next door to them before they moved to California that noticed Agnes's level of cleanliness at home, and how she would be seen sometimes with a toothbrush on the sort of brass of the front door, scrubbing. Everything was absolutely spotless.
Perfection.
Obsessively so?
It sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What was it about Agnes? What was going on for her?
Do we know?
Well, I guess and I want to throw this out to you guys and see what you think, but I guess what I did a bit of research on obsessive cleaning, and it can be part of OCD.
Yes.
Yeah, well, as someone in recovery from OCD, and it kind of kicked in at a really, really young age, one of my first manifestations of it was compulsive hand washing when I was probably 8 or 9. And what I remember specifically was the feeling of being unclean, literally. Not just physically unclean. I think that's probably what started it, but it was also more metaphorical. You know, it was shame based. It was emotional based. I was trying to wash away shame or wash away emotions, and obviously it wasn't working. So I would just wash and wash and wash until my hands were raw and bloody.
So what you're talking about there is a externalization of an internal pain.
I guess that's exactly right. And I happened to be really, really unhappy at boarding school at the time, with no real outlet, because we weren't really allowed to talk about how unhappy we were. And so maybe that's what I was trying to do, was trying to wash the pain away.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know about OCD isn't just about the behaviour, it's or even general anxiety, it's about intrusive thoughts.
Yes, and it's often very fear-based. So people are scared that if they don't do this action, then something might happen. And if things aren't in line or in place, then something bad is going to happen, which is, in my experience, generally trauma-related.
It's interesting because when I think about, Agnes wasn't born cold, withdrawn and unable to tell people she loved them in a way that was enough for them. Something happened to her.
Yeah, there must be something in her past that led to the OCD.
Yeah.
If that's what it was.
If that's what it was.
Let's just be clear, we're not diagnosing Agnes with OCD.
We don't know for sure.
No. But yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I wanted to say that is because, mums don't decide not to love their children.
No. And quite likely is that she really did love her child. She was just unable to express it.
Exactly. So, yeah, moving on. I mean, the insecurity was a big feature of Karen's life, partly because her brother had this incredible talent, but also Agnes's controlling behaviour. And I guess she was doing that to make herself feel safe in many respects. And I guess I was wondering, Chula, Agnes favouring Richard, or indeed a mother favouring a child over another child or children, what might the effects be of that, both on the favoured child and on the unfavoured?
I think we're all pretty aware of it, in terms of knowing that can cause damage when one child is favoured over another. And it's quite a complex situation because various different things can happen to varying degrees. But I would say, in a general sense, the favoured child can often end up with survivor's guilt, or a kind of feeling that things aren't fair for the other person. And they can then even put their needs and wants to one side to try and compensate for what it is they're receiving. And for the child that isn't favoured, that usually attacks their self-esteem and that feeling of not being good enough and not as good as the other child or the sibling. And I think it really impacts on their ability to really embrace their sibling. So they'll feel all the love for their sibling, but at the same time they'll have this burning resentment underneath. And children aren't really consciously aware of that. They just have all of that going on in their unconscious, and then that gets acted out in the relationship.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite hard to talk about this stuff, but I came from a dynamic very similar to that, in that I have an older sister, who's 4.5 years older. And the minute I came along, basically my mother decided that I was the best thing since sliced bread, and decided to give me all of the attention. And that had a profound impact on the entire family dynamic, to the extent that I think by the time that she was around about 11 or 12, my sister decided to go away to boarding school and literally asked if she could leave. And that was pretty much her exit from the family. And I understand all of those things that you've spoken about. I really relate to them.
And were you aware of that at the time?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
So I felt A little bit abandoned, a little bit rejected.
By who?
By my sister.
Oh, I
Right.
see.
Yeah.
So that's what you're aware of, the
Yeah.
fact that she didn't like you much.
That's kind of what I thought. It's
Right, okay.
why doesn't she like me?
Yeah.
Which is looking back on it now, it's quite sad. I don't look back on myself with pity, because I have a lot of empathy for what she was going through.
Yeah.
But it disrupted the relationship between you and your sister.
And the entire family.
Right.
It disrupted the relationship between my parents,
Yeah.
because my dad was acutely aware of what was going on, and so he made up for it by forming a really strong bond with her. So actually what ended up happening in the family was that there were two sides. There was me and my mum, and my sister and my dad.
Wow.
I mean, what's really striking is when I was doing my research, is the sort of absence of the father.
But that was a cultural thing as well in the 70s, wasn't it? It's like
well,
the
yeah, I
dad
guess
got
so.
up, went to work,
Yeah.
came back,
Wasn't
had
there all
supper,
day.
and
Yeah,
the
for
kids
sure.
were already in bed.
Yeah, for sure.
And the problem with that is if it leaves a vacuum, then you can get a situation where one of the children fill that parental role.
Right.
And then even in certain cases, like eldest boys can become a surrogate husband to the mother.
So it's fascinating, isn't it? I guess what I'm saying is it's a really easy thing to fall
Fall
into
into,
without being conscious and aware of it. So I think probably it would be a good idea to focus on anorexia itself, actually, and say a little bit more about that. There's a lovely quote, actually. Maybe, Matt, you want to read it out?
Yeah, sure. So this is a quote from 1966 by the journalist Rob Herberger. If anorexia has classically been defined as a young woman's struggle for control, then Karen was a prime candidate. For the two things she valued most in the world, her voice and her mother's love, were exclusively the property of her brother, Richard. At least she would control the size of her own body.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I mean, anorexia is very much a disease of control, where an individual will control the intake of food to regulate disordered parts in life elsewhere. And I think that can be in the here and now, it can be in the past, and it's very specific to each individual. What I've found in the work that I do with people with anorexia and other eating disorders is that there's often a parent in the background who is quite controlling or has been quite controlling, or there's significant trauma where an individual has lost control. So that the gaining of control through controlling the intake of food can often be very much a reaction to having lost control or had control being taken away at some point.
Right, that makes
So,
so much
it's
sense.
almost like a sort of it's regaining agency over one's body, oneself, to be able to say, I'm going to eat that, I'm not going to eat that, in response to maybe finding themselves in a position where they didn't have a choice.
Yeah. There can also be a very deprivatory aspect to it, where somebody is almost, punishing themselves through starvation. And it can be a cry for help. It can be something where people are saying, look, I'm hurting, and this is how I feel on the inside, and they're trying to show that through their behavior. And I don't say that in an accusatory way at all. It's very much an addictive disorder.
So in a way, is it like wearing the scars of self-harm to show other people that you're hurting?
Well, ultimately, it is self-harm,
Yeah.
like any other addiction.
Yeah.
It's just we seem to look at things very differently, but I think it is an addictive disorder just like any other. Although, as we said earlier, the level of potential fatality is much higher.
And also, I think it's probably important to say that somebody can be suffering from the illness of anorexia and look like a normal weight,
Yeah.
all intents and purposes.
Yeah, it's not always that sort of incredibly underweight person.
No.
The beginnings, you can't always tell. It's really difficult. People keep it very hidden at the start. And sometimes it isn't until someone's become very ill that it's apparent.
It just seems so fucking brutal.
It is. And the hard thing is that the one thing that's going to help someone is the one thing they really, really don't want to do. And the only place of, like you say, agency that they have. And I think for many people with eating disorders in treatment, they feel like their power is being taken away. And it's difficult to grasp that sense of actually, as you get better, you will feel that you have more power and more control and more at peace with yourself.
Well, the irony is, depriving yourself of food is going to have an impact on your brain, your thinking, your body, and actually, it takes away agency. I guess it's a bit like alcoholism, isn't it? It's a bit like what you're after. It is actually diminishing.
Yes.
The more you take alcohol or drugs, the more impaired you become. Yeah. And in fact, the less capable you are of making the decisions that you really are trying to make in the first place.
Or to feel all right.
Yeah.
You can't even make a decision to feel all right.
No. It's definitely a pursuit of diminishing returns.
I was watching Paddy McGuinness's ex-wife, Christine McGuinness. She'd made a really interesting documentary on the correlation between autism and eating disorders.
Wow.
She was undiagnosed autistic and ended up at a eating disorder unit talking to a woman who ran it, and she said that they had tested their inpatients against the criteria for autism, and I think it was about 30%.
30%?
Wow, that's so high.
Massive.
Yeah, I mean, it might have even been more.
Yeah.
So I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that perhaps what looks like anorexia could actually be a undiagnosed autism in relation to the texture and feel of some foods.
Oh, I see.
So it might look like someone's losing weight equals they've got an eating disorder.
Yeah.
But it might be somebody is actually responding to what they feel in relation to the texture and feel of their food in relation to their autism.
Right. Wow, that's fascinating.
It's fascinating,
It's all
isn't it?
interrelated, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at addiction and neurodiversity, especially ADHD, it's like the research now is through the roof about the levels of co-occurring or comorbidities, you'd say, Sheila, of ADHD and addiction.
So let's get into moving on with Karen's life, finding her voice, Karen becoming the focal of the band. I mean, I guess at this stage, what I want to say is I dropped in our group WhatsApp chat a clip of Karen, as it was the Dick Carpenter trio, him and her and a bass player, I think. They were in an all-American college TV show, and they covered Martha Reeves and Vandellas, yeah, Dancing in the Street.
That's it.
So fabulously covered in the late 80s by your friend Mick.
My friend
and,
Mick.
Your friend Dave. And my God, that woman can play.
Yeah.
And her, what I really noticed about her is the life energy, her fluidity in terms of how she's holding her body, how the energy's moving through it, how she is just lost in her vibe, and her groove is incredible. And she just looked the happiest I've ever seen her when she was behind the drums. And of course, after they signed to A&M as the Carpenters, it's also probably worth noting at this point that when she was signed to a smaller label before A&M, I think it was the bass player but he actually was most interested in Karen and could have ditched Richard at that point.
Okay.
And of course, probably that would have been the first time that's ever happened to Karen. But in any event, they were signed as the Carpenters.
So that, to me, that's really interesting, because we often talk about how band members leave their family of origin and then they join the band, their family of choice, and that sometimes they bring the dynamics from their family of origin with them.
Yeah.
But in this case, Karen and Richard were still in their family of origin.
Yeah.
So they were still playing the same roles, probably right up until that moment when somebody wanted to pull Karen up front and give her the attention that for all of her life she hadn't received, that had all gone to Richard.
Yeah.
Also, what I was thinking about in relation to that is that the fucking band names, their surname is the family name.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so it couldn't get any more enmeshed.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's true.
Chula, enmeshed.
Enmeshed, as in, well, there's no separation, is there? There's no separation between family and professional life.
Well, I was thinking about, what does enmeshed mean, actually?
I would say it's when there's a symbiotic relationship has been formed and the boundaries have gone down. And I guess, mother and the baby is the most enmeshed kind of physical relationship.
They're literally in their body.
Yeah. But the thing for them is that there was no separation, and you don't really know where your home personality and your public persona split or divide or meld together. And that's the enmeshment.
So in this instance, we're talking about a band identity and a family of origin identity being exactly the same.
Yep.
Yeah.
Except when Karen was asked by A&M to step up from and come out from behind the drum kit and to go to front and centre stage.
And that must have been so disruptive for everybody, including her.
Can you imagine the shockwaves that would have gone through that psychic unit? What do you mean, Karen? What do you mean coming out the front? What do you mean Richard's not the star? What do you mean this has been the family script for fucking 25 years?
All that time.
And it's a shame, actually, because I don't think she wanted to do that. I've heard her say that she refers to herself as a drummer that can sing.
Right.
So the idea of being exposed probably is quite distressing.
Well, watching that clip, it really feels like that's her instrument.
Oh.
I mean, she's got such a natural talent for it.
Yeah, and she enjoyed it, and you can see the pleasure, can't you?
For sure.
And I'm wondering if maybe learning the drums for her became her safe place. Like when she was a young girl starting to learn the drums, it must have been quite unusual in that era. If that became her kind of the place that she went to feel safe and find her identity and get her sense of self-esteem and all of that she was missing in the family home.
Yeah, it would have been very empowering in the dynamic with her brother.
Yeah.
And also, you don't need anybody else to play the drums, do you?
No.
It's like, fuck off. These are my drums. These are my drumsticks.
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
And I'm the loudest.
And I can choose when I want to play and when I don't.
Yeah.
And Chula, you are a drummer. You were a drummer in a band. We've talked about this before. What's the significance of drums? Why did you pick up drumsticks and not guitar?
Well, I was a guitarist before. So for most of my teens, I was a guitarist in the bands. And then I fell into playing the drums. Right. And definitely once I got there, I felt more at home. And for me, it's about, I don't want to be right at centre stage or up front. I like hiding behind the drum kit. But I also like knowing that everybody can hear me. And
you might not be able to see me, but fuck me, can you hear me?
Yeah, and I guess that's related to what I grew up with my mum being blind and wanting to get attention. I made noise, and I love, I love playing. Yeah, it's all linked.
Wow.
I have done the work, so I do know.
You've done the work, Sheila. This guy's done the fucking work.
But what I would say is that for Karen, I think it would have been incredibly empowering sitting behind the drum kit.
But don't forget what she was doing was singing and drumming.
Yeah. And that's a talent in itself.
I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? So moving on with Karen's story, and we're around about 1973 here.
Right.
So the Carpenters took off really fucking quickly. As soon as Karen, A&M were right. And as we know, having a barrier, a drum kit, a keyboard in front of the singer does interfere with the audience's ability to connect. We know that that's true, right? So she got up from her drums and went to the front of the stage. Sadly, she saw a TV appearance of herself. It's nothing to do with how she actually looked. It was just shitty fucking wardrobe as far as I'm concerned. Nonetheless, she saw her little tummy and decided that it just wasn't good enough. It was something that she wanted to get rid of. Obviously the idea of, the perfect woman. So we have to look at it contextually. Obviously now, which I love about the kids, the Gen Zers, and it started with the millennials, didn't it, really? This kind of idea that you can be an incredible artist, you can be attractive, you can be you don't have to conform to what I was growing up in the 90s. If you didn't look like Kate Moss, you're fucked.
Yeah.
But it goes up and down, doesn't it? Because if you look at the shots of Marilyn Monroe when she was at her absolute prime, she was what the word would be voluptuous.
Yeah, women's bodies, don't get me started, I've said this before, I might say it again, are dictated to by whomever is in control of, I don't know, it could be, Renaissance artists, couldn't it? They decided that this was the idea, that it aligned somehow with what they were trying to convey in their art. but generally speaking, it's going to be men. And I'm not saying, oh, men, fucking. I'm simply saying that, it is just a simple fact that up until recently, men have been in positions of power. And ironically, a lot of gay men have been in fashion and photography and managing the Beatles, managing the Rolling Stones, so there's been a lot of influence from everybody other than women about what their bodies should look like.
So do you think that social media now has put it back in the hands of the women? Do you think that women have now got more say about what women should look like, or how they can look, or the fact that there's actually no rules whatsoever?
I tell you what, I think it's across the board. I think it's the idea of Beth Ditto. It's Ed Sheeran, with his lovely, gorgeous copper red hair. It's people that don't look like the classic people that look extraordinarily handsome or beautiful. There's been much more of a move to the ordinary person that is allowed to step into that arena and on the basis of their talent. Having said that, we all know what's going on in terms of social media, kids' exposure to ways in order to diet or to hide eating disorders or self-harm. So I don't think it's gone away. I just think there's more space for people to be able to be who they are.
And that's got to be a good thing.
Of course. Yeah, 100%. After Karen saw a gorgeous little paunch, she got a personal trainer and a dietitian, but really it was about how do I change? How do I not have that? Obviously, that probably started off well and then spiraled downwards. I don't think it's true to say that before she didn't have anorexia.
No.
I think it's probably true to say that it hadn't been expressed. It didn't have the potentiality. And I think probably being exposed in the way that she was and being looked at in the way she was within a societal context in the way that it was probably tipped it in that direction.
Yes, definitely. I think eating disorders, like all addictions, can fluctuate. So sometimes people seem to be getting better, and then environmental factors or changes like coming out to the front of the stage and having more eyes upon her would have perhaps even triggered the eating disorder.
Yeah, that's right.
There's also a big word alert, it's my turn this time, called epigenetics.
Right.
Which is basically to say that you might have the genes of a condition, but it hasn't been activated. And then something that happens in your social or cultural circumstances will actually activate it. And so in Karen's case, it's quite possible that kind of coming in front of the drum kit and then seeing herself on telly, and that entire circumstance that you've just outlined could have then been the thing that triggered what was already lying dormant in her.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if we're saying it's about control, then you've got Agnes, which had her control over her surroundings. So you could say that was within the sort of lineage, if you like. If not learnt behaviour, then it might arguably genetically inherited.
Absolutely.
There's that incredible mice experiment where mice, they're horrible doing experiments on mice, but this kind of idea that a group of mice were given an electric shock within their cage, and like a smell was puffed into their cage at the same time. So they started associating the smell with a shock. Then the mice were bred, and the baby mice at some point when they were growing up were exposed to the same smell, and their physiological response was of shock.
Right.
Poor fucking mice and mice babies.
I know.
Honestly.
But I guess what I'm saying is that they didn't experience the initial trauma.
No.
Intergenerational.
It must have been passed down genetically. And I think we're only really getting into that now, aren't we?
Yeah,
absolutely.
If you think we're only one generation away from the Second World War, us lot.
Yeah.
Just think about that for a fucking minute. The whole of Europe.
Yeah.
It could explain somewhat why we all feel so fucking unhappy, because we're carrying a lot, potentially.
Yeah.
So as this kind of went on, the dieting, the compulsive exercise, which tends to go hand in hand.
Yes.
She was getting thinner and thinner and thinner, noticeably so. They had a manager called Bash, who was attempted to get her help many times. He said they were always talking about Karen.
Right.
What are we going to do about Karen? I know.
Yeah.
So there's a great quote here from Bash. The fact that she was anorexic was discussed innumerable times. There was every attempt to get her to seek professional help. But I believe her family was the kind of family where the mother would say, we can take care of ourselves. We don't need to have someone help. This is a family matter.
Ooh, it's a family affair.
Family affair.
Wow.
And of course, the thinness did get her mother's attention.
Yeah.
And I guess that's a difficult thing as well in terms of treating people with anorexia, because actually she's getting, unconsciously, it's not on purpose, but she's getting what she wanted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also that pulling rank, that secrecy, that kind of keeping it all under wraps, keeping it all in the family, the shame and all of that. That's just what keeps families sick.
Yeah.
And we see it all the time of just like, no, we're not going to let any outsiders in. This is our stuff.
And even the situations where someone's come out of rehab and then the person that says, oh, you can have just one drink is a family member.
Yeah.
I don't know, somehow I feel like the women in the families, sexuality, their energy, it really seems to be suppressed. What I really noticed when she was playing the drums was how free and engaged and lit up she was, and how when she's singing, it's very introverted, it's very in.
Right.
She can do joyful, of course she can, top of the world, but it's a lot about longing. I don't know, maybe I just fucking identify it, but this sort of disconnection between her sexual energy that society doesn't allow women to experience. You're a whore or a Madonna, aren't you? There isn't any in between that's acceptable. And I'm just wondering how uncomfortable Agnes would have been by seeing a sexy, alluring, attractive, beautiful woman who was attracting a lot of male gaze, and how, if there is anything going on within that.
Well, she would have been frightened that her control was going to be taken away.
Yeah, there's Karen looking incredible, front stage, hair done, makeup done, absolutely killing it. And, all these, there's going to be loads of guys that are going to fancy her. And, how's mum ever going to be able to box that back up?
Yeah.
But also, isn't there something about jealousy that comes into the picture? I've heard a lot of cases where the mother has been very, very jealous of the daughter's success, looks, happiness, all sorts of things. So that might have been another dynamic at play there.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
So it was probably quite triggering for everybody, wasn't it? It certainly seems like it. Karen's failing health couldn't be ignored for much longer, and she did end up being hospitalised with nervous exhaustion and suffering from severe, physical symptoms.
Right.
So much so the huge, massive was going to be a, crazy, grossing tour that had to be cancelled.
Well, at least they cancelled it. Thank God for that. At least they didn't drag her onto the aeroplane.
Push her through.
Yeah, and we all know that that's not necessarily, tours aren't necessarily cancelled, are they?
No.
And all it does is exacerbate the issue.
Yeah. Tours need to be cancelled, shit needs to be sorted,
Yes.
tours need to be rebooked, right?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
So, obviously we've been talking about Karen, but in the meantime, round about this time, Richard was, I think he went into rehab for Quaalude addiction.
Quaalude addiction.
Yeah,
wow.
I know F all about Quaalude.
That's
I don't
nasty.
know. Yeah, I don't know.
Should we ask our resident expert? Don't tell me.
So
You've
Quaalude,
taken in 1983.
I took loads of them.
Quaalude, otherwise known in this country as Mandrax, and we've spoken about Mandrax
Right, okay.
before, because it's one of the things that tipped poor old Brian Jones over the edge. Really nasty downer sedative, highly addictive. Starts off sort of trying to sleep and relax, ends up kind of being taken recreationally, mixed with alcohol, mixed with other drugs. And ludes, as they would call them, would bring, typically they might bring you down after a cocaine binge. You might turn to them at 4 a.m. When it was time to kind of chill out and light the fire and listen to music instead of dancing.
But why would you take them if you weren't high in the first place?
For anxiety. for highly strung. If you were, you know, maybe, I don't know, I'm speculating, but potentially after the buzz of a gig, you know, that come down. Yeah. You know, when you come off stage and there's still 2 or 3 hours of real high emotional energy left. Okay. But you need to go to sleep on the tour bus.
Yeah. Because you've got to get up the next morning, blah, 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 carry on, blah, blah, blah.
And one of the things about Quaaludes and Mandrax is that they have a terrible effect on the nervous system.
Right.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting, actually, because whilst Richard was away, Karen actually started recording some songs herself as a solo artist. Right. And she completed an entire album. Mm-hmm. And I listened to it this morning, actually. It's very different from the Carpenters.
Is it? I've not heard it.
Yeah, I haven't.
It's a Karen Carpenter solo album.
Wow.
It didn't end up getting released, actually. Phil Ramone produced it.
Jeez.
And there are a lot of up-tempo disco tracks where Karen's, you know, letting herself go a little bit. Right. It's almost like she turned into, like, I don't know, like fucking Diana Ross as opposed to a brownie.
So it just wasn't her?
No.
Or it was
was expressing an aspect of her that you just didn't see.
But why wasn't it released then?
Broadly speaking, it didn't fit the Carpenters brand.
Oh.
They didn't want a solo album coming out that was going to impact what they built up in terms of
their trajectory.
Brand identity.
Wasn't wholesome enough, maybe.
Yeah. Richard didn't want her to do it.
So this
Mum
is Karen trying to
do it.
step out.
Karen,
and come into her
this
own.
was her chance to escape.
Yeah.
And her and Phil Ramone made this, you know, made 22 songs, and actually, and she called him and she was in tears. Yeah. And she said, they're not going to, you know, they're not going to let me do it.
Everyone's trying to push her back down.
So everybody pushed her back in her little fucking rabbit cage again.
That's very
I
sad.
actually feel really fucking angry about that.
Yeah.
It's just like the one at the time when she could actually express herself as a whole, you know, to individuate, to bring all the parts of herself into this one, you know, adult body. You know, she just gets fucking divided up
Devastating.
again.
And you said it, the adult body, and what she was doing was exercising control over her body that she wasn't able to exercise over her career.
Well, it's just an extension of that control. Yeah.
You do this for us. This is and again, we're talking about what that person does for the group. You know, what role are they playing for the group?
Yeah.
Such a massive, important point that I just never knew.
You could say she was scapegoated, really.
100%.
Yeah.
Just got put back in a cage.
It's a bit like someone who tries to escape a cult, isn't it? It's like, you're bad, you're coming back and you're going to be punished.
Yeah. So, unsurprisingly, she ended up getting married to a man who, I think they dated for like a couple of months. I think it was a bit whirlwind. She had explicitly expressed her desire to have a family to Thomas
To have
James
babies.
Burris, yes. And for some fucking God knows what reason, Thomas had a vasectomy a few weeks before their wedding day. Yeah. And a few days before they were due to get married, she found out. Went to Mum, told her. And Agnes responded, so the story goes, you've made your own bed, go and lie in it. Ooh. So she went down the aisle, married a man who couldn't have babies, even though she wanted babies.
Go and lie in your bed, but don't make babies in it.
Go and lie in your bed. You know, it probably fucking suited Agnes quite well, doesn't it? Because it's sex, babies, you know. It's almost, it's like fucking she's like being castrated, this woman, from every single fucking angle, isn't she? You know, and it's like, oh, Karen died, you know, what a shame. No, not what a fucking shame. I mean, where were her allies, you know?
Yeah, there was no enlightened witness.
There wasn't an enlightened witness. Having said that, I did watch a very good documentary, Starving for Perfection.
Right.
And she was really good mates with a few women, actually, but Olivia Newton-John.
Oh, really?
Yeah, who I love.
Bless her. Wow.
Back to Thomas and his empty ball sack.
Sorry. Do you want to say that again?
Yeah, no, I fucking want to say empty ballsack Thomas, who then
That's not me, by the way.
Who
Thank you
then
very
tried
much.
to.
I've had quite a lot of children.
Matt said more than his fair share. Yeah, so Evelyn Wallace, Karen's secretary, said that Thomas would often come into the office and basically nick her money. I think he presented himself as a wealthy man. I don't think it turned out that he actually was. So, unsurprisingly, 14 months later, they got divorced.
Right.
Poor thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about empty ballsack Thomas either.
No, I mean, I hate Thomas. I wanted to ask you actually, Chula. I guess we know that making questionable partner choices can be related to our early relationship with our parents or caregivers.
Yeah, I mean, they say you marry your parents. I think there is some truth in that, and definitely Freud felt that the paternal and maternal relationships were paramount to creating a blueprint of personality, and that all those developmental years and the relational aspects of those years made us who we are, and therefore that informs who we're attracted to, who we connect with, what it is we're looking for in relationship.
I really like that. I don't know who said it, but we see the world not as it is, but as we are. We see the world as we are. We think we've got a subjective point of view. I might add that I'm on... I'm not adding I'm on dating apps so people can write in, although feel free. What I'm saying is
What's
that...
your screen name?
Is that,
Was
yeah,
that an
exactly.
advert?
Exactly. Knock yourselves out. But it's kind of like the idea of my preconception as to what this man would look like. What would he do for a living? What would he look like? What would his hair colour be? You know, this kind of idea that...
All of that comes
But are you
from
saying
our upbringing.
that? Are you saying that subconsciously that's your dad? Is that what you're saying?
Well, not exactly.
I guess what I'm saying is that there's two things. One, that we choose people to be in relationships that are familiar to us, even
Right.
if it's destructive.
Yeah.
And two, we actually see the world according to the blueprint that Chula just
Right,
mentioned, I think.
Okay.
I believe. It makes sense to me. And that if we don't challenge our assumptions, like my assumptions on Hinge, for example, we can end up repeating the same patterns.
Yeah.
It's all unravelling.
It's all unravelling. Karen was taking a lot of laxatives, like a lot, like 80, 90 a day, when you should be taking
80 or 90 pills?
Yeah.
Gosh.
When you should be taking 1 or 2 a day or per dose or whatever.
Wow.
Karen Ramone, a friend of hers, who she spent a lot of time on tour with in Europe and South America, said laxatives were her main companion.
Gosh.
Oh, that is agony. Jeez Louise.
She did seek help, actually, from Stephen Levenkron, who specialised in eating disorders.
Which was quite rare in the 70s.
Yeah, it was really
presumably.
rare in
Yeah.
the 70s because nobody knew anything, nobody knew what to do about anorexia. And, he seems like he did quite a lot of good things. I think it just reminds me of those kinds of, I don't know, who did Brian Wilson see? You know, those sort of very sort of standalone individuals in Laurel Canyon or, you know, in LA or New York who kind of saw to the rich and famous. Just as a sort of one-man band, really, without any sort of supporting cast.
Like a modern-day snake oil salesman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know enough about him to say whether that was the case or not.
Yeah.
I do know that he convened a family meeting where it looks like he was looking to start conversation. Obviously, he recognised that anorexia was as we say, addiction is a family illness. It doesn't come about in isolation.
No.
So was it like an intervention, Sam?
I don't know if it was an intervention.
Sounds more like a
because
family session.
It sounds like a family session,
Right.
and it sounds like he was trying to open up some dialogue
Yeah.
where there previously hadn't been,
Yeah.
where Karen was being honest
Right.
about what was going on with her and how ill she was. And apparently she sat there crying constantly and saying, I'm sorry.
Oh.
So apologising for
Being ill.
being ill.
Yeah.
And so it seems that Richard wasted no time at all about telling her how much he loved her. And
Lovely.
but sadly, Mum wasn't able to.
And that dynamic's really important because I think with this whole empathy for the devil type title, we're talking about, you know, how there can be a stigma upon people with addictive disorders, and it's seen as some kind of moral deficiency, when in fact, as we know it well, as an illness. You know, it wasn't her fault.
No, it wasn't her
said.
fault. And it's interesting, isn't it, that even in that situation, even ill and fucking, you know, she's still apologising for it. Sadly, Agnes didn't shift out of her position. So I think she got better to a degree where her and Richard, in February 1983, went out and spoke to stage producer Joe Layton about the potential of putting together a Carpenters tour.
Oh wow!
So there was a degree of optimism, but that was the 1st of February 1983, and turned out that would be the last time Richard would see Karen alive.
Gosh.
On Friday morning, the 4th of February, Agnes would find Karen collapsed on the floor at her home. The autopsy revealed that she had poisoned herself with ipecac syrup, which is at the time was commonly used for inducing vomiting. So it poisoned her.
Wow.
And I guess her body would have been really fragile at
Can
that
you imagine?
point. So
Yeah, it's not going to take much, is it?
no.
She was probably very weak.
Also sounds like she had enough.
Yeah. It wasn't getting any better, was it?
No.
And Agnes finding her as well. Something about that, isn't there?
Yeah. And it must have been absolutely tragic for Agnes. And I think it's probably worth mentioning here that, you know, the famous Philip Larkin poem that everyone quotes, they fuck you up, your mum and dad, they don't mean to, but they do.
Yeah.
You know, and we've talked a lot about Agnes's role in all of this, but it's really important to remember that most of the time parents do their very best. And it's actually, there's a quote that I heard recently about how you are parented by your grandparents, because they're the people who parented your parents. And we've talked about trauma, we've talked about the war, so we don't know what was going on for Agnes, other than, you know, she probably wasn't very well herself. And it's just important to point that out, I think, in all of this kind of, you know, the area of culpability, you know.
Well, I think the way we work is that, you know, we're not looking to blame and shame.
No.
Because our own experiences have shown, how it's fucking pointless. It doesn't get you anywhere. And you know, if we're talking about epigenetics, if we're talking about being parented by your grandparents, if we're talking about being one removed generationally from the Second World War, at what point does it become one person's fault?
Exactly.
It fucking doesn't. It doesn't.
Well said.
So just to move on, I mean, Karen Carpenter was an incredible woman. She lived up to her potential in a little cage that she was allowed to. And I guess it kind of makes me wonder what would have happened if she'd been let out and her full being had been expressed. But nonetheless, she left the world the recordings of her voice and the recordings of her musicality. She played with the drums on the albums. Richard came good at the end. She loved Richard. Richard loved her.
Wow.
I really wanted to just express my appreciation and my, you know, admiration of her and her talent. And I guess and you sort of alluded to it before, actually, Matt, family systems are tough. And we all play parts in them, don't we? And what we can see here is a family system that moves straight onto the stage. And it's probably unsurprising during the, you know, in terms of the time and the place, that all the problems moved onto the stage as well. What can it teach us about helping those who, you know, I'm just thinking about my relationship with my friend and with anorexia, and, you know, how difficult it is to watch it. What can be done?
Well, I think one of the things that Karen's story really brings home is the powerlessness that we might have over somebody else's addiction. And even though there were people there who were supporting towards the end, by then it was too late. Her addiction, the power of her addiction had taken over, and it just unfortunately took her to the end. So I think whilst we do a lot of stuff to help people get well, and people can get well, you know, we do recover, But there are many people who don't, and it's something to be taken very seriously and not to be messed around with or ignored.
And as you were saying, Matt, earlier, it seems that even now there is still a fucking problem with our system about dealing with people that suffer from anorexia. It's dependent on what you weigh, and what you weigh is not the fucking point, is it?
It's what you weigh in your BMI, literally.
Yeah.
Your body mass index.
So there's still some work to be done there, I guess. So, where are we going to leave Karen?
Where would you like to leave?
Yeah, where would you like to leave?
Do you know what? I'm a bit split, actually, because on the one hand, I love the idea about her doing a sort of Diana Ross disco dance floor, fucking killing it in her sort of, you know, sexy dress and hair and makeup, and just feeling into all of her energy spectrum, including her sexuality. But there's something about her drumming and being behind the kit. I don't know, there's something about that I feel like that's where she felt safe.
Yeah.
That's where she felt most at home. So let's do that. Let's leave Karen there. So God bless Karen, you fucking star. There you go.
Oh, I've got goosebumps.
Thanks,
Sam.
Yeah.
That was so lovely. You just painted such an incredible picture. I've never seen Karen Carpenter that way before. I feel a bit choked up. Of someone in a cage, you know, this absolutely gorgeous being locked in a bird cage. I've got this image of her in a bird cage on, you know, one of those perches that swings back and forth singing. You know, it's so tragic, but so beautiful. Thank you.
Pleasure.
So what's your one for the road this episode?
Well, I've got a weird one for the road because it isn't a book. It is literally that YouTube clip of Karen playing the drums and singing Dancing in the Street. And something I forgot, actually, I don't know when it was, but Vanity Fair, I think, did a top drummers of all time.
Right.
And she came fourth and John Bonham came fifth, and he had the right arsehole about it. Fucking surprisingly.
Right.
And I think she even phoned him up and sort of slightly apologised.
Oh my God.
But anyway,
That's
so
funny.
she's a phenomenal drummer, and I want to, we'll be leaving that in the show notes, and that's my one for the road.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks so much for listening and watching.
Next week, I'll be digging deep into the life of Whitney Houston.
See you for now.